I'm going to sort of clarify really what is, inverted commas, the challenge, or what is the promise of the future. And you couldn't have cued me better, actually, again, referring to new old age, and
right,
that is issue. Yeah. This is what was listed, as it were, I've sort of cover in my 10 minutes, and I've actually been given 15 minutes, and I felt it was probably a little bit ambitious, particularly as I didn't know anything about most of them. And certainly I knew far less than everybody else around the table about most of them. Am I in your way? Are you okay? You can see all right. I'm going to say a little bit about where we're expecting the population to going, or where it is going. Not just life expectancy, but general NIC, and that really relates to your point about new old age and so on. That's quite important. Special concerns about physical dependency, cognitive impairment, financial dependency, and also social exclusion. Social exclusion is very important. It seems to be an increasingly sophisticated electronic age, and I'm now going to confess publicly that I'm one of the world's latest adopters. I think this mobile phone, which most of you will smile at, I haven't had a mobile phone for very long. I started using emails without the help of my secretary in 2003, and I was using WordStar 87 until 2003. Confessions now over. At this stage, So in a way, I'm quite a good test case for the elderly population, because in many cases, of course, older people will be late adopters. We still send out to our children to get the video recorder working and that sort of stuff. But let me just tell a little bit about what you know already, but actually clarify it a little bit, because you have a sense there are more old people out there. That's the sort of first thing. Well, just how many more? You can see what's happened to life expectancy in the UK. It's changed enormously. And that has changed our whole sense of the course of life, hence Jane's referral to new old age, what we call the third age in our parlance. The idea being that first age is childhood, second age is your general adult life when you're bringing up your children and you're developing your career and so on and so forth. The third age is after retirement and before the fourth age, which is when perhaps medical problems start to dominate your life, a period perhaps closer to the traditional conception of old age. But it's the third ages that I think are really important, and I'm going to focus on those a bit. But it's interesting to see why life expectancy has changed, and in the first half of the 20th century it was due mainly to decline in infant mortality, and also due to getting on top of by preventing or treating infectious diseases. And everybody thought that was going to be that. After that, life expectancy would flatten out. It hasn't. And the extraordinary thing is that mortality at later ages has fallen absolutely gobsmackingly. And I'll give you a reason why in due course. Here we are. That if you look at cardiovascular disease, it has actually fallen to 30% of its rate when I started being a doctor. Now, I can't personally take credit for that, but you can see that is an enormous change. And look what happened to coronary heart disease in a decade. It's below 65, fallen by nearly 50%. These are extraordinary figures. And life expectancy at birth, 1980 was 71 in males, and it's gone up to 75 and a bit. So half a decade in a relatively short period of time. Similar pictures for females. This is from the Office of National Statistics, government body, must be true. Pause. And then you can see it, the House of Lords in their select committee said that life expectancy in the UK is increasing at a rate of about 2 years for each decade that passes. Now really life expectancy didn't change from the time of Charlemagne until really the middle 1800s in Europe. And so that's why we have a great difficulty getting our head around what's happening to our population or what's happening to the course of life. And life expectancy in later life, likewise, is continuing. So if you get to age 60 or get to age 80, you're still getting an increasing life expectancy. That's life expectancy. What everybody's worried about is what kind of nick you're in when you are old and you're living longer and longer. And there are certainly plenty of pictures of gloom and doom. Here's one based on some studies done in the late 1980s by Jean Martin and her colleagues, which looked at the rate of disability, that's the vertical axis, against age. And as you can see, there's a very sharp rise round about sort of 65 to 70. Exponential picture. So everybody thinks more old people living longer, absolutely dramatic increase in the burden on health and social care. Big worry. And in fact, if we think about the future, there are 4 potential scenarios. That you could have 1 year of additional woe for every year of life gained, Or you might have some additional woe, not a whole year's worth, but some additional woe for 1 year of life gain. Or you might gain an extra year of life, but the amount of woe remains steady. In other words, instead of the woe kicking in at 75, it kicks in at 76 when you live an extra year. Alternatively, most excitingly, and what drew me into geriatric medicine, was the possibility that you might have an increased life expectancy, but less woe nonetheless. You might have what Frias many years ago called the compression of morbidity. And that appears to be happening in some places, and actually is possible in all places. It's not a biological impossibility, and we could talk about why it isn't if you wanted to, but it's less relevant to our discussion today. So if you look at life expectancy and healthy life expectancy, say between 81 and 2001, you can see in women life expectancy at 65 had increased by 17%, but healthy life expectancy had increased slightly disproportionately more. So the fear that every additional year of life was additional year of woe is not panning out in practice. And there are some more recent data which support that even more strongly. And there are some data in the States, very, very big databases, huge databases, because the accountants keep an eye on what's happening in America. And if you want to know the truth, you don't ask a doctor, you ask an accountant. And basically looking at decreased rates and severity of disability at every stratum of old age. So if we look at possible futures, there are various scenarios. If you take the top right-hand corner, that's the bad old days, namely 2010, that's here, top left. You can imagine that Mr. and Mrs. unisex average carry on going along till about their sort of middle 60s, and then things start going wrong a bit. And the rate of disability in proportion, or the extent of disability increases until you reach 100% disability, which is what we used to call death. You can't do it. Now what's interesting is this area under the curve here. How much woe before you die? So which way is it going to go, let's say in 20 or 30 years' time? Well, there's the nightmare scenario model, which is that Mr. and Mrs. unisex average have trouble breaking, comes in their middle 60s, but due to all sorts of clever medical technologies and all sorts of supportive systems, they carry on living till 110 or whatever, and most of the last 10 or 20 years is absolute bloody misery for themselves and for everybody around them. They spend the last 5 years of their life in an ICU communicating with the rest of the world by eye blinks, that sort of stuff. Well, that actually is not happening, but that's the nightmare scenario that people have often worried about. There are two other much more tasty scenarios, and one is the receding horizon model, which is that the onset of serious or irreversible illness or disability is postponed by the same amount as death. Same area under the curve of human woe, but it's all been shifted to the right. That's quite tasty, because it means the proportion of your life in woe is less. There is, however, an even more tasty scenario, and this appears to be the one for very good biological reasons that probably will pan out if we play our cards right. And that is, yes, a significant gain in life expectancy, reaching your 100% disability, but a greater gain in healthy life expectancy. So that area under the curve has become considerably less. Now, achieving this depends on lots and lots of things. It doesn't massively depend on huge medical breakthroughs. It does, advances in managing Alzheimer's disease and so on and so forth, but there are many other things that play into ensuring that we certainly don't have that we don't probably have this, but we have this, which I think is the tastiest scenario. And this means I gradually come to the theme of today. But the big thing that worries everybody is cognitive impairment. Where the two main causes of cognitive impairment are stroke and Alzheimer's disease. Well, the story on that front actually is not as frightening as you may think. If you look at stroke, for example, there have been lots of studies showing how effective our stroke prevention strategies are now working. That in Oxford they looked at a fixed population at two intervals, the early 1980s and the early noughties, and they looked at the incidence of stroke in that population in both of those periods of time. What they found was an exponential curve, because stroke is very much an age-related condition. But that was how things were in the 80s. This is how things are in the noughties. And at every level, at every age rather, there's been a significant drop in the incidence of stroke. And whereas you expected on the basis of the aging of that population for the stroke incidence to increase by 30%, it's actually fallen by 30%. Now, stroke, overt stroke, or otherwise undeclared stroke is one of the biggest causes of cognitive impairment, and it also makes Alzheimer's disease worse because you have a synergistic effect between Alzheimer's disease and stroke. So you can see there's an area where perhaps a lot of the worries about cognitive impairment are not going to materialise. But having said that, there is going to be a significant burden of disability, both physical disability and cognitive disability, and it may in toto rise over the next few decades. There is, of course, the worry about financial dependency. You know, these are some data now, a bit out of date actually, from the continuous mortality investigation. This is a database kept by increasingly dry-mouthed, sweaty-palmed, dilated-pupilled actuaries who are looking at what's happening to the draw on pensions, and we're all aware of this huge debate about pensions. But if you looked in 1997, 65-year-old men who had life insurance and pensions plans could expect to live to 83 years and 2 months and then have the decency to disappear. By 2005, they could expect to live to 86 years and 7 months. But 2015, they were hanging on in there until the age of 90, and I think those data will have to be updated even more to show what is happening to the extension of the period of retirement and indeed of financial, withdrawing one's pension. But of course we don't actually have to have that problem. That is entirely a self-inflicted problem. The idea we can't afford to make or keep old people healthy is a load of nonsense. It's cheaper to keep people in good nick than it is to keep them in, look after them when they're in poor nick. And of course, as for not being able to afford healthy old people, that is equal nonsense, because it assumes an older person is going to be entirely a consumer and not at all a producer. And obviously the Turner report and various other reports have looked at that in the broad brush, but we need to look into the capillaries of society to see it at every point where older people are prevented from contributing in a positive way, as opposed to being treated as an inevitable, inescapable dependence. Old age is a biological phenomenon, of course, but it's also a social construct. And older people can be producers as well as consumers. You can solve the pensions problem by just pegging the median age of retirement to the median age of death. Ken Manton in America suggests that we should retire 8 years before death. It's a bit disappointing for those of us who are expecting to die at 90. But you can see that you've just got to get your sums right. It's a matter of sums. That's all it is. It's nothing to do with, it's human institutions. But absolutely central will be social inclusion. And I want to talk about the final point, social exclusion, which brings us right to what we're going to talk about, which is about technology, because social inclusion is increasingly mediated through technology. And this is where I refer back to my, as it were, late adopter mode. To some extent, I've only just started taking part in the big conversation which is mediated by electronics. So clearly e-literacy and educating older people not to be frightened of new technology, whether it's computer technology or whatever, is absolutely central. Helping people to navigate an increasingly electronic collective reality is going to be very important. So that to me is central. There are, of course, and Guillain referred to some very superb examples, and there's a huge literature which I suspect is known better to many others than me, although I have been involved in some of the techniques of using advanced technology for supporting people, particularly people with cognitive impairments, and the development of smart environments to enable them to be roaming freely without being in danger. And then there's the question of delivering medical monitoring and medical care, and indeed medical information through telecare and so on and so forth. So all of those, it seems to me, are going to be absolutely central to ensuring that older people are socially included, so they are indeed contributors and feel part of the party, as opposed to being treated as or regarded as either a challenge or a burden. And I can tell you, if at the age of 82 I'm regarded as a challenge or a burden, I shall respond by being an absolute pest. And I don't. This was just a PS that came out of a conversation with Guillain earlier on. But of course, one of the things I'm very interested in is in the arts, and in particular people with cognitive impairment. And actually the potential impact of dance, music, poetry, reading groups on older people is absolutely extraordinary. And I've seen it with my own popping eyes. And another group that may be extremely important when it comes to disseminating technology, and many of you may be familiar with it, is the University of Third Age, which I think is an extraordinary organisation, but has yet to be used by other organisations to the maximum of its capability when it comes to disseminating, cascading out some of these technological prostheses and supports and enrichments that come from the world of electronics. I haven't mentioned avatars and I haven't mentioned robots, but for a good reason, because I think that potentially is a difficult area. I think robots, hands-on care, for example, to me is very importantly delivered by a sentient human being who is full of human compassion and sensitivity. So we can get the mechanics right, get a machine to wash your bottom and that sort of stuff, fine. It's how the bottom is washed that perhaps often makes a big difference. And when it comes to avatars, I mean, potentially it's a huge enrichment, potentially it's a source of confusion. Which is not to say I was absolutely gobsmacked by some of the things referred to. So that's really a bit of the framework. In other words, the future is going to be one of increasing life expectancy. It's not going to be one in which increasing life expectancy means increasing woe expectancy, but there will be a greater need, if you look at the numbers of people, for some kind of support. That support will be easier to deliver if people are not socially excluded. And I think the key to social inclusion must be electronic and the kind of deliberations that have been taking place here in Nesta. So thank you.